Live. Under the blinding lights of a national broadcast, Karoline Leavitt thought a smirk and a few sharp words could put Jasmine Crockett in her place. Instead, one sentence detonated a coast-to-coast firestorm. Was it just blunt talk, or the most calculated public takedown in modern politics? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The cameras swept across the stage as the live panel from Austin, Texas unfolded before a coast-to-coast audience. It was supposed to be a policy-driven discussion, a meeting of political minds dissecting legislation, leadership, and the year's most pressing issues. But even before the first segment wrapped, the air in the room had shifted. Jasmine Crockett had just finished answering a question about leadership expectations, speaking calmly about the double bind she and other black women in politics faced. Too direct, and she was labeled aggressive. Too reserved, and she was dismissed as unqualified. It was a measured observation, not an accusation, but it landed with quiet weight. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Well, maybe if some people stopped playing the victim and actually acted like leaders instead of running a victimhood campaign, we'd get more respect in politics. A ripple of murmurs rolled through the audience. The moderator blinked, her hand hovering near her mic. Before anyone could respond, Karoline pressed on. And honestly, Jasmine, people don't take you seriously, not because of your skin tone, sorry, but because you act like everyone owes you something. That's not leadership. That's entitlement. The moderator froze. A few in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked, her posture steady, no flicker of anger or shock crossing her face. The silence stretched, and in that space, the sting of the words became sharper. Viewers at home felt it instantly. Clips began appearing on social media before the segment had even ended. Captions in bold. Did she really just say that? Hashtags began to form, spreading from Twitter to TikTok to Instagram Reels. Comment sections lit up with disbelief, outrage, and, among some, applause. Back in the studio, the conversation stumbled forward, but the moment had already escaped their control. The camera caught one last shot of Jasmine. Before the lights of national television and the viral clips that would soon define the week, Jasmine Crockett had already carved out a reputation for precision. She began her career as a civil rights attorney in Texas courtrooms, where the stakes were as high as the odds against her clients. Her cases were often uphill battles, defending people and communities that had learned to expect the system to work against them. It was in those courtrooms that Jasmine honed her trademark style. Quiet, deliberate, armed with facts she could pull like a blade at exactly the right moment. She didn't believe in rushing words or chasing applause. Every statement was backed by documentation, every argument timed for maximum clarity. That discipline followed her into politics when she ran for Congress. While others leaned on soaring speeches or populist slogans, Jasmine carried binders, annotated memos, and pages of receipts. She believed in winning arguments, the way she'd always done, in the record, not just in the moment. But being a black woman in public office meant that challengers didn't stop at policy debates. Jasmine understood the unwritten rules she was expected to follow. Speak softly to avoid being called aggressive, smile more to be considered approachable, avoid any reaction that could be spun as emotional. She had lived through enough examples to know the game wasn't fair, but she refused to play it at the expense of her dignity. That awareness made her a master at hearing the things that weren't said outright, the coded language, the subtle tone shifts, the conversational traps meant to undermine her credibility. She'd been on panels before where opponents baited her, hoping to provoke a soundbite they could replay out of context. Usually she let the moment pass, focusing instead on her policy points, but this time felt different. This was not just about her personal resilience, it was about the precedent being set in front of millions of viewers. In her mind, there was a clear line between political disagreement and public character assassination. The former she welcomed. It was part of democracy. The latter, she decided, needed to be met with more than words. As she sat on that stage in Austin, she already knew this might be the moment to draw a boundary she had never drawn before. Not in politics and not on live television. She would keep her composure, but she would not let it slide. Karoline Leavitt entered the political media world with a different kind of energy. Young, sharp-tongued, and confident, she had quickly built a name for herself as a conservative voice unafraid of confrontation. Her rise was fueled by her ability to turn sharp remarks into viral clips, the kind that racked up views on social media and earned her spots on cable news panels. She marketed herself as the person who would say what others want, and her audience rewarded her for it. But Karoline's bluntness wasn't random. It was deliberate. Those who had worked alongside her described a pattern. Before a live appearance, she would review the list of fellow panelists and sketch out lines designed to put them on the defensive. If her opponent was a progressive woman of color, the comments often leaned on the edge of personal, framed as criticism of style or demeanor rather than direct policy disagreement. To her, it was a tactical move. Throwing someone off balance meant controlling the flow of the conversation. She'd had her share of backlash before, but it never seemed to stick. In her corner of the media world, pushback was reframed as proof she was hitting a nerve or challenging the PC narrative. This ability to flip criticism into credibility became part of her brand. Every time she was accused of crossing a line, her following seemed to grow. That pattern made her bolder with each appearance, convinced that no moment was too heated to recover from. Karoline's track record included dismissive comments about diversity initiatives, a speech mocking the concept of implicit bias, and a podcast segment where she laughed about code switching as if it were a performance rather than a survival skill. Each time she weathered the reaction, spinning it into another example of saying the quiet pie out loud. To her supporters, this approach was refreshing honesty. To her critics, it was a calculated form of provocation designed not to debate but to diminish. Former staffers, speaking anonymously, said her prep sessions for high-profile appearances included pre-written jabs to deploy if certain talking points came up. The goal wasn't just to win the argument. It was to disrupt the opponent's rhythm and claim the upper hand in front of the cameras. On that day in Austin, Karoline believed she was doing exactly what had always worked for her. She saw Jasmine Crockett's remarks about racialized expectations in leadership as an opening to push back, to frame the Congresswoman as leaning on identity rather than merit. But in her confidence, she didn't account for how quickly the moment could shift from a tactical exchange to a cultural flashpoint. The studio air was thick, the kind of artificial cool that never quite cuts through the weight of expectation. Cameras panned across the audience, catching nervous glances and folded arms. The moderator, shuffling papers like they might reveal an easier question, turned toward Jasmine Crockett. "Congresswoman," he began, "how do you navigate the racialized expectations placed on women of color in public office?" His voice was careful, almost too careful, like he knew the question carried both opportunity and danger. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her hands folded, her posture a study in composure. "It's not just about navigating," she said evenly. "It's about refusing to let stereotypes dictate the boundaries of my leadership. I represent a community that understands what it means to have their voices diminished, their competence questioned before they've even spoken. That's why I prepare. That's why I document. That's why I refuse." She didn't get to finish. Karoline Leavitt's voice cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. "Stop playing the victim." The words hung there like a crack in glass, small at first, but spreading quickly. A few audience members gasped audibly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the shift from policy debate to personal strike. The moderator froze, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't reach for her mic. She didn't even look at the moderator for rescue. Her eyes locked on Leavitt's, steady and unblinking. The silence that followed wasn't passive, it was deliberate, the kind that forces everyone else to realize they're holding their breath. Leavitt, perhaps mistaking restraint for weakness, leaned back with a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. A few sympathetic laughs from her side of the stage rippled through the audience, but they died quickly, swallowed by the tension in the room. The cameras caught every micro-expression. The stillness in Jasmine's jaw, the way her fingers tapped once against the desk before becoming still again. Millions watching at home could feel it. The decision to withhold words, to let the weight of the comment sink in without immediate retaliation. Somewhere behind the glass in the control room, a producer mouthed something to another. "Keep the shot tight, don't cut away." The director obeyed. The frame stayed locked on the two women, the contrast between motionless composure and smug satisfaction telling its own story. The moment wasn't over. It was just loading. The moderator cleared his throat, perhaps hoping to guide the conversation back to safer ground. "Congressman, if you'd like to respond," he began, but Karoline Leavitt was already leaning in again, her tone coated in feigned reasonableness. "And just to be clear," Leavitt added, "this isn't about your skin tone. Nobody here is holding you back. Because of that, it's about your attitude, the entitlement you carry into every conversation. That's why people don't take you seriously." It was the kind of line that was crafted to sound objective, but every syllable was laced with dismissal. The audience reacted in fragmented bursts. A few claps from her supporters, a wave of murmurs from those who recognized the coded slight. The moderator's voice faltered, caught between the pressure to keep order and the spectacle unspooling before him. Jasmine took a slow breath, her chin lifting slightly. Her hands unfolded and rested flat on the table. She didn't match Leavitt's volume. Instead, she kept her voice measured, each word intentionally placed. "I work for my community," she began, her gaze steady. "I work for people who have been told their struggles don't count, their pain isn't real, and their rights can wait. If that makes you uncomfortable..." The words weren't shouted, but they landed with precision. A few heads in the audience turned sharply toward Jasmine, eyes widening at the controlled defiance in her tone. The contrast between Leavitt's jabs and Jasmine's restraint created a rhythm, provocation met with substance, accusation countered with purpose. Leavitt opened her mouth to interject, but the moderator finally stepped in. "Let's allow the Congresswoman to finish her point," he said, though his voice carried no real authority now. The room's focus wasn't his to command anymore. Jasmine continued. "Entitlement is walking into a conversation assuming you already know someone's worth before they've had a chance to speak. Entitlement is dismissing lived experience because it doesn't match your worldview. I show up prepared because I have to. I document because history demands it. I speak because silence has never protected the people I represent." On social media, the moment was already being sliced into split screens, Leavitt's smirk frozen beside Jasmine's stillness. Comment sections filled with arguments over tone, over intent, over who won the exchange. But inside the room, there was no need for graphics to show the momentum shift. The energy had moved, pulled toward Jasmine's side of the table like a magnet drawing foolings. The moderator shuffled his papers again, his nervousness almost comic now. But Jasmine wasn't done. She leaned back slightly, not to retreat, but to let the silence breathe once more. The same silence that had unsettled Leavitt minutes before. The audience could sense it. The counterstrike was just beginning. The segment's timer ran out, and the moderator announced a short commercial break. Studio lights dimmed slightly, crew members hustled in with water bottles, and the panelists adjusted their seats. Off mic, but still within earshot of nearby staff, Karoline Leavitt leaned toward one of her allies and said, "I just said what everyone's thinking." Her tone was casual, almost smug, as if she had just delivered a punchline that landed perfectly. Jasmine heard it. She didn't flinch, didn't glance over, didn't give Leavitt the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Instead, she calmly adjusted her microphone, tightening the clip on her blazer with deliberate care. The motion was slow, precise, the opposite of defensive. It was the body language of someone who knew the next round would not be fought on volume, but on presence. Around them, production assistants whispered into headsets, confirming camera angles and checking live feeds. Yet more than one staffer stole glances toward Jasmine. There was something magnetic in the way she sat, unshaken, grounded, her breathing steady. It was the same composure she had honed in courtrooms, depositions, and town halls. When the cameras came back on, the panel returned to the discussion. But viewers at home were no longer watching the topic so much as they were watching them. The split-screen feeds were relentless. On one side, Leavitt with her confident half-smile. On the other, Jasmine with her poised stillness. Analysts on live Twitter threads began dissecting the exchange in real time, identifying what they called coded disrespect and tone framing. Some viewers saw Leavitt's remarks as blunt honesty. Others recognized the subtle patterns, the undermining language, the attempt to cast assertiveness as arrogance. That gap in perception became the night's secondary debate. Even before the show wrapped, hashtags emerged. Stillness speaks, not entitled. Each carrying its own interpretation of the moment. Inside the studio, Jasmine didn't rush her responses. Every time the conversation swung her way, she took a breath, tilted her head slightly, and spoke with the same controlled clarity as before. It made Leavitt's earlier interruptions feel more frantic in contrast, as though she had been pushing against a wall that wouldn't budge. By the time the panel concluded, no one remembered the moderator's closing remarks. What they remembered was the way Jasmine never once raised her voice, yet managed to command the room. The silence she had held earlier wasn't passive, it was tactical, forcing the audience in the studio and at home to sit with what had been said. As the credits rolled, the conversation online only intensified. Viewers were asking a new question. In an age of constant noise, had Jasmine just proven that the most powerful weapon in a political debate was knowing when not to speak? The broadcast had barely ended when the first clips began ricocheting across social media. A TikTok upload, no longer than 15 seconds, froze on Jasmine Crockett's impassive face as Karoline Leavitt delivered the entitled line. Someone overlaid bold white captions, "Did she really just say that?" Within an hour, another version appeared with an even sharper hook. "Stop playing the victim." By midnight, Twitter's trending page was a battlefield. Hashtags split the conversation into opposing camps, not entitled and tell it like it. The most viral variation, however, wasn't text at all. It was a gif of Jasmine blinking once, slowly, after Leavitt's jab, paired with the caption, "The silence that shook Texas." Cable news producers caught wind of the traction before their own late-night segments had wrapped. CNN cut from international coverage to a replay of the exchange, framing it as a live television flashpoint about race, gender, and political tone. Fox News seized on it too, spinning the moment as a woke overreaction to honest criticism. MSDNC devoted an entire discussion block to whether Leavitt's comments were calculated or impulsive. Podcasts scrambled to push out emergency episodes. On one popular political commentary show, the hosts replayed the full 90-second interaction 5 times, each pass focusing on a different detail. The exact second Jasmine's lips tightened, the way Leavitt's shoulders leaned forward, the murmurs from the audience. Another podcaster, known for long-formed breakdowns, slowed the footage frame by frame to highlight what she described as performative dominance cues in Leavitt's body language. By the next morning, YouTube's trending tab was littered with reaction videos. Influencers and amateur analysts uploaded side-by-side breakdowns, complete with arrows and freeze frames, turning the exchange into a cultural Rorschach test. Some called Jasmine's restraint a masterclass in political debate control, while others accused her of playing the race card without saying it. Even late-night comedy couldn't resist. On The Daily Show, the host replayed the clip with exaggerated sound effects. A boxing bell before Leavitt's jab. Then a dramatic tumbleweed rolling past as Jasmine stayed silent. The punchline landed, but the underlying discussion was real. Viewers weren't laughing at the idea of coded disrespect. They were laughing because the silence had made the disrespect impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Instagram filled with quote cards. The most shared one featured Jasmine's later remark from the panel. "I work for my community. If that's uncomfortable, good." Paired with a minimalist black and white aesthetic, it became the unofficial emblem of her response. What made the detonation so complete wasn't just the volume of content, it was the speed. In less than 24 hours, the moment had jumped platforms, crossed political lines, and embedded itself into the wider cultural conversation. On TikTok, Gen Z creators stitched the clip into their own videos about microaggressions. On Facebook, older voters debated whether this was a case of generational misunderstanding or deliberate disrespect. Karoline Leavitt's own account saw a surge in engagement, but not all of it friendly. Her supporters applauded her bluntness, framing her as a truth-teller under attack. Critics flooded her comments with the "not entitled" tag and looping clips of Jasmine's steady gaze, For every defense, there was a counter-argument, each one amplifying the moment's reach. By the time primetime news rolled around again, it was clear this wasn't fading quickly. Analysts noted that the exchange had transcended the original topic of the panel, becoming a stand-in for larger arguments about how political debate is waged in America. The clip was no longer just about what was said, it was about what it revealed, and people on every side wanted to claim it. By the second day, the viral moment had escaped the digital echo chamber and spilled into the physical world. Cafeterias in state office buildings buzzed with lunchtime debates, forks clinking against trays as employees dissected every angle. In one corner, a small group of young staffers replayed the clip on someone's phone, pausing to analyze Jasmine Crockett's jab was justified or over the line. Barbershops, those unofficial forums of American politics, became flashpoints for the conversation. In Houston, a local shop turned the clip into a looping screen on the wall, customers weighing in between fades and shaves. One man insisted Leavitt had merely said what folks think but won't admit, while another countered that there's a difference between truth and coded disrespect, and she knew exactly what she was doing. Living rooms weren't immune either. In suburban neighborhoods, families found themselves unexpectedly split during dinner. Parents and adult children clashed over what the silence meant. Was it strength, or was it a refusal to defend oneself? In one particularly tense exchange caught on a local news segment, a father and daughter argued live on air after volunteering to be interviewed, embodying the generational divide the moment had sparked. Then came the flash poll numbers, and they were unlike anything analysts had seen in years. Among independents, a majority, 56%, said they believed Crockett's silence was a deliberate and effective response to an inappropriate comment. Even more striking, 41% of Republicans polled admitted the jab had crossed a line, though most stopped short of calling it racist. Democrats overwhelmingly rallied behind Crockett, seeing her composure as a political and moral win. Commentators rushed to interpret the data. Some framed it as proof that the public is growing weary of aggressive, personality-driven politics. Others warned that the numbers only reflected a temporary emotional spike and would fade. Yet the energy in community forums and radio call-ins suggested something more lasting was in play. Supporters of Crockett's approach began framing her reaction as an act of courage. To them, silence in that moment wasn't passive. It was a calculated, disciplined refusal to legitimize disrespect. Grassroots groups circulated digital flyers that read, "Dignity speaks louder than outrage." College debate teams analyzed her posture and timing as part of their weekly training exercises, pointing out how she allowed her opponent to overplay her hand. Leavitt's defenders, meanwhile, leaned hard into the argument that this was all political correctness run amok. Conservative talk radio hosts replayed the clip to roaring approval from callers, arguing that blunt truth-telling was being punished by an overly sensitive public. Memes in her camp mocked the idea that silence could be considered a win, framing it instead as avoid. Even among neutral observers, the discussion was more complicated than a simple win-loss scorecard. Editorials in major newspapers explored whether public figures, especially women of color, should be expected to respond instantly to provocations, or whether measured restraint might be the new form of strength in political debate. In coffee shops, high school classrooms, and Sunday church gatherings, the same fundamental questions emerged. When does criticism cross into coded insult? Is dignity best defended by speaking up or by refusing to engage? And in a political landscape dominated by shouting matches, could silence itself become the most disarming weapon? By week's end, the split wasn't just ideological, it was deeply personal. People found themselves questioning their own instincts, reevaluating how they would react under that kind of public pressure. The clip had stopped being about Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt alone. It had become a mirror, forcing Americans to consider what they valued more in a leader: fire, or the unshakable calm to let an opponent's words condemn themselves. Inside the West Wing, the moment was treated less like a political dust-up and more like a brewing crisis. Staffers in the White House Communications Office spent the morning combing through social media metrics, stunned by how fast the clip had eclipsed every other headline. The trending hashtags weren't just domestic, they were lighting up feeds in London, Sydney, and Nairobi. One aide described it as a slow-motion PR detonation when leaked messages from political consultants revealed a scramble to contain the fallout. Advisors debated whether to double down on defending Karoline Leavitt's comments or pivot to a narrative about healthy political debate. Both options carried risk. Defending her risked alienating moderates, while pivoting could be seen as an implicit concession. By midweek, internal polling had confirmed what many feared. Then came a leak that changed the stakes. A senior aide, speaking to a reporter off the record, claimed that the communications team had held a closed-door meeting where a staff lawyer advised Leavitt to stay on script during future live appearances to avoid the kind of exposure that can create liability. Was enough to set off a fresh round of speculation about whether they saw legal as well as political risk in her remarks. As the noise built, another bombshell landed. A respected investigative journalist released audio from a political strategy retreat held months earlier. On the recording, a voice identified by multiple sources as Leavitt's could be heard workshopping lines to use against progressive women of color during debates. One of the trial phrases was eerily close to what she had said to Crockett on stage. The implication was unmistakable. The jab hadn't been a spontaneous thought. It had been rehearsed. In Arizona, a federal judge with a reputation for candor took the unusual step of issuing a public statement in a local paper, reflecting on a past case involving similar coded language in political advertising. Though he didn't name Leavitt, his admission of regret for not speaking sooner was widely interpreted as a veiled commentary on the incident. Legal analysts seized on the judge's words, debating whether they could signal a judicial shift toward treating such rhetoric as potentially discriminatory under civil rights law. Meanwhile, non-profit watchdog groups sensed momentum. One civil liberties organization announced plans to compile a comprehensive archive of coded remarks made by elected officials and high-profile political figures, framing it as a transparency initiative. Within 48 hours, they had secured crowdfunding support well beyond their goal. The reverberations reached beyond the political sphere. Corporate boardrooms took note, especially companies that had recently partnered with political figures for branding campaigns. A sports apparel brand quietly postponed an ad rollout featuring Leavitt, citing timing considerations. Industry insiders admitted it was a direct response to the uproar. For the first time in her career, Leavitt's reputation as an unflappable media force seemed to be under strain. Allies who had once celebrated her sharpness now urged her to read the room. A former staffer summed it up in a candid interview. Karoline's strength has always been controlling the message, but this time the message is controlling her. In Washington's high-stakes chess game, this was more than a public relations skirmish. It was a signal that the institutions, courts, media, advocate groups, even corporate partners, were beginning to reassess the boundaries of acceptable political confrontation. And as the ripples spread outward, one thing became clear. The silence that started it all had grown louder than anyone in power expected. Within days, the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt stopped being just a clip from a political broadcast. It became a cultural reference point. On college campuses from New York to California, students wore T-shirts with bold, block-letter print that read, "The Silence" on the front. And graphic designers posted minimalist posters online featuring nothing but Crockett's profile in grayscale, a faint microphone outline, and 3 small words beneath, "No entitlement here." They went viral, almost instantly. TikTok users remixed the footage into everything from spoken-word poetry to slow-motion edits, scored with cinematic music. One version, set to the sound of a heartbeat, cut between Leavitt's jab and Crockett's calm gaze, ending with the title card, "This is how you fight, without raising your voice." The clip racked up over 20 million views in 48 hours. Debate clubs and civics classes seized on the moment as a teaching tool. At Howard University, a panel of law professors dissected the exchange in front of a packed auditorium, using it to discuss the intersection of free speech, racial coding, and the art of political restraint. At a high school in Chicago, a social studies teacher paused mid-lesson to show the video, then asked students to write about whether silence could be a form of resistance. The story's reach extended far beyond academic circles. On late-night television, comedians worked the confrontation into their monologues, some mocking Leavitt's tone, others marveling at Crockett's poise. Podcasts dedicated to political analysis devoted entire episodes to unpacking the dynamics at play, with some hosts arguing it signaled direct dynamics on identity. A growing chorus on social media reframed the moment as a referendum on the value of image versus substance in politics. Hashtags like "Truth over theatrics" and "Silence Speaks" began trending alongside Crockett v. Activists pointed out that Crockett's refusal to react immediately not only denied Leavitt the emotional blowback she might have been counting on, but also allowed the public to project their own interpretations onto the pause, a tactic often used in courtroom strategy but rarely in televised political debate. The broader cultural conversation shifted. Articles in national outlets began asking whether the public's appetite for constant verbal sparring had finally reached a limit. Could restraint be the new form of political strength? For younger voters, especially those fatigued by endless shouting matches on cable news, the answer seemed to be yes. By the end of the week, what started as a flashpoint in a televised debate had morphed into a symbol not just of Crockett's personal composure, but of a wider longing for political discourse that prioritizes dignity over volume. And whether people loved her or loathed her, almost everyone agreed they hadn't seen a moment quite like it in years. Inside political circles, the Crockett-Leavitt clash forced quick recalculations. By Monday morning, Republican strategists privately admitted the exchange had legs, meaning it would stay in the news cycle far longer than they hoped. A few of Leavitt's usual allies on conservative talk shows began subtly distancing themselves, suggesting she might have chosen a better phrasing. The shift was subtle, but in the world of politics, such half-measured critiques were the first sign of an erosion in unconditional support. For Democrats, the moment became a rallying cry. Party leaders amplified the clip across their own channels, pairing it with calls for civility and issues-first campaigning. Crockett's favorability numbers among independents spiked in the first flash poll following the incident, with a notable jump among voters who described themselves as politically tired. In media industry boardrooms, producers studied the confrontation as a ratings case study. The broadcasters' network saw a surge in replays, ad revenue, and digital engagement. Executives were already pitching follow-up specials on composure under fire and the politics of tone. Several high-profile journalists requested sit-down interviews with Crockett, eager to frame her as the face of a new, measured style of political debate. Corporate America noticed too. A few consumer brands that had previously kept their distance from hot-button political moments began quietly reaching out to Crockett's team about partnerships for civic engagement campaigns. One sports apparel company floated the idea of a limited-run Strength in Stillness line, highlighting her now iconic on. Internationally, the story was reframed through a different lens. In British and Canadian papers, coverage focused on the ethics of political discourse in America, contrasting Crockett's demeanor with the rising tide of political showmanship. In several European outlets, commentators argued that her refusal to engage in verbal theatrics underscored a deeper problem, that American politics had normalized disrespect as entertainment. Meanwhile, Leavitt doubled down in her own media appearances, casting herself as the victim of coordinated outrage and accusing the left of weaponizing her words. But the more she repeated her talking points, the more they were fact-checked, replayed, and dissected alongside the original footage. Polling suggested her base remained loyal, but her natural affability among moderates dipped for the first time since her rise in conservative media. By the end of the second week, the Crockett-Leavitt confrontation had shifted from a viral moment into an enduring political narrative. Strategists from both parties were forced to ask an uncomfortable question. In an age of instant outrage, could the most devastating political move really be saying nothing at all? The studio lights were still hot, but the room felt different now. The panel had ended, the audience had thinned, and the chatter had shifted to whispers. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to leave. She waited until the last microphone check was done, then stepped forward toward the cameras that were still rolling for the post-show feed. Her voice was steady, almost quiet, the kind of calm that makes people lean in instead of tune out. "Truth doesn't backfire," she said, looking directly into the lens. "It just burns where it needs to." The words hung there not as a retort to Karoline Leavitt's jabs, but as a declaration about something bigger. The standard of respect, the measure of accountability, the way public discourse should be. She reached down to the table, picking up a thin folder. "This is the transcript of tonight's discussion, alongside a record of every time I've been told to tone it down while defending my community. I'm not going to summarize it. I'm going to release it, every word, every pause. Let the public decide if dignity is a weakness. Pausing, she let the cameras catch her eyes narrowing just slightly. We can't keep rewarding the loudest insult in the room. We have to start valuing the most honest voice instead. Documentation matters. Facts matter. You deserve more than spin. You deserve proof. She placed the folder back on the table, but this time she slid it forward so it was in full view of every still photographer in the room. The implication was clear. The record wouldn't be hidden. It would be part of the public domain by morning. This isn't about me, and it's not about her, she continued, never once saying Leavitt's name. It's about what we choose to normalize. If we normalize disrespect, then that's what we'll get in our leaders. But if we normalize substance, maybe, just maybe, the next generation will see politics as a place for truth, not performance. The last words came without a raised tone, without a flourish. So here's my ask. Don't just share this clip. Share the context. Read the record. Hold every one of us to the same standard. That's how we change the temperature in this country. She gave a small nod, then stepped back from the podium. No dramatic exit line. No glance at the other panelists. She turned and walked off stage, her heels clicking against the studio floor, the folder still sitting there under the glare of the cameras. The shutter clicks followed her like an echo. And somewhere, beyond the bright studio lights and the trending hashtags, viewers at home were left with a question she never had to ask out loud. In a political debate, what matters more? The volume of the voice or the weight of the truth?